You're the only one who was scheduled, so thank you so much for coming to see me, my presentation. So, yeah, thank you for joining me this afternoon, and uh, welcome to my presentation, Anxiety and the Adult Learner. The closed captioning is turned on for accessibility, and this presentation will be recorded, although now be recorded on my phone. My name is Adrian Smith, and I produced this presentation for PIDP 3300, Teaching Adults with the Brain in Mind, which I'm currently taking at Vancouver Community College. I'm excited to share my research and thoughts with you, and I will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge with respect and humility that BCIT and VCC are located on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish nations of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I am very grateful to live, work, and play here. I'd also like to point out that this work is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license, meaning you're free to share this material even for commercial purposes, adapt or remix this material even for commercial purposes, and all it requires is attribution. So a link to the original license and attribution to myself as the creator. So a little bit about me and my motivations for creating this presentation. I'm an instructor at BCIT. I teach first and second year millwright apprentices. My subject matter expertise comes from 19 years in the field as a millwright. In the pictures on the screen, you can see me on the left, covered in chocolate from when I worked at Purdy's Chocolatier in Vancouver. And in the middle is me inside of a extending conveyor at a package handling facility that I've worked at. So the role of a millwright is an industrial mechanic. In their workplaces, my students are heavily relied upon by their coworkers. And within their workplaces, they have a great amount of expertise and experience. So coming to school can definitely be a sort of fish out of water experience for them. And I've noticed in my role as an instructor, there's a prevalence of anxiety amongst my students, anxiety about school and their work, and a lot of cases of students self-reporting anxious feelings or nervousness about tests and evaluations, and things like demands for information constantly, like needing to see their grades and know how they're doing in the class, and just demands for feedback, which of course is part of our role as instructors. But the rate at which I'm being asked for this information indicates that there's definitely some anxious feelings about it going on. So I really wanted to learn as much as I could about this topic because of what I've noticed at work. And one thing I can say is I found that it's been very extensively written about. There's a lot of information out there about anxiety, and the main thing that I found is it takes a lot to sift through all the information. There's a lot of I don't want to characterize it as misinformation, but there's a lot of conflicting information out there. So if you find yourself researching something similar, definitely due diligence on checking your sources is very important. So my need to find out about anxiety in my students is what's going to drive the agenda for today. We'll start out by defining and clarifying what is anxiety and what isn't anxiety. We'll look at how prevalent anxiety is. And we'll look at the physical effects of anxiety and the effects on the brain. and how that is going to affect an adult learner or a learner in a classroom, and some of what we need to know and what we can do as instructors. So let's start out by defining anxiety. In my research, as well as my interactions with my students, I find that the word anxiety has different levels of severity. One student might say, "I'm feeling a little worried about the test tomorrow," where another might be explicit and put a name on it and say, I have test anxiety. Similarly, one student might say, "I'm feeling anxious," and another might say, "I suffer from anxiety." So I'm interested in characterizing what is anxiety and what isn't, to define it, and also to quantify it. At what point does it become debilitative, or is it a disorder? So the American Psychological Association characterizes anxiety as an emotion that presents in the way of feelings of tension, worried thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure, sweaty palms, upset stomach, and even things like headaches. And maybe you've experienced these feelings. I know that I have from time to time. I've also noticed them frequently in my students, and I would posit that it's probably a fairly common occurrence for most people returning to school. Anxiety is not, however, fear. Fear and anxiety are two words that get used interchangeably, and they're related. They both have to do with worries. But according to the American Psychological Association, anxiety is not the same as fear. They're often used interchangeably, but anxiety is considered a future-oriented, long-acting response to broadly focused on a diffused threat, whereas fear is an appropriate, present-oriented, and short-lived response to a clearly identifiable threat. In our adult students that we teach, anxiety is about the future. They want to pass the course, maybe advance their career. There's a threat of failing, so they have those worries on their minds. You'll notice I've got graphics of bears walking on a trail and signs telling us not to. So to characterize what's fear and what's anxiety, I would say that fear is what happens when you're face to face with the bear on the trail, like the picture on the right. That lady is dealing with that bear in an immediate way. She's probably experiencing fear. On the left, there's a sign warning that there might be a bear on the trail. So anxiety is the worry that there might be a bear somewhere up ahead on the trail, but we can't really see them yet. And to extend that metaphor a little further, we could say that anxiety disorder would be saying that I'm never going on a walk again because there's a possibility that there might be a bear. So in this context of school, anxiety is worrying that we might fail, and fear would be knowing that we're going to. And I don't think our students are experiencing fear. I think most often they're experiencing that future-oriented worry. So I would characterize that as anxiety. One thing we can take solace in, anxiety is normal. Feeling anxious is a normal part of life. Many people experience worry or anxiety about everyday things such as health, money, school, work, family. And actually, anxiety can lead us to take action to mitigate those worries or to eliminate that threat. If we're worried about our health, we can eat better, we can exercise. If we're anxious about money, we can create a budget or even take on a second job. But there's actions we can take. And sometimes anxiety is enough to motivate us to take those actions. But anxiety disorders are something different. Anxiety disorders are what happens when anxiety doesn't go away. The key difference between having an anxiety disorder and normal anxiety is the extent of the dysfunction and the distress that it causes. Anxiety disorders involve more than occasional worry or fear. For people with these disorders, anxiety does not go away, and it is felt in many situations, and it gets worse over time. There's several types of anxiety disorders, including generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, social anxiety disorder. Generalized anxiety disorder, the first one that I mentioned, is one of the more common diagnoses, and it's said to be characterized by persistent, excessive, and unrealistic worry about everyday things. And I think that we can key in on that word, unrealistic. So anxiety disorder is beyond the realm of feeling a little worried about one's performance at school or one's performance at work. And you could take it to the point of believing that it's impossible for one to perform better. And it's a true mental disorder. It requires a diagnosis. It will require professional treatment. Another way to differentiate anxiety from anxiety disorders is the duration. Boardman wrote an excellent article talking about anxiety disorders, and they note that feeling anxious doesn't mean you have an anxiety disorder. The duration of which you feel anxious can indicate that you do. If you have persistent, excessive, unrealistic worry about things for at least 6 months, including feeling restless, easily fatigued, having difficulty concentrating, experiencing physical symptoms like muscle tension, that's a disorder, especially when it goes on for so long. The anxiety results in significant distress or an impairment in social or occupational areas, and it's not always attributable to a physical cause. So that's characteristic of anxiety disorder, where it's not always attributable to something real. And anxiety results in a significant distress or impairment in social or occupational situations. So just being out in public or being at work or school can trigger this significant anxiety in people with anxiety disorders. Looking at the prevalence of anxiety in adult learners, the 2018 National College Health Assessment is a survey conducted by the American College Health Association, and it surveyed over 88,000 students in Canada and the US, and it found some pretty stark numbers. 63.4% of college students in the US felt overwhelming anxiety in the past year. 23% reported being actually diagnosed or treated by a mental health professional for anxiety in the past year. So those would be people that are on the verge of or already suffering from what we would call an anxiety disorder. But that third statistic there, 35.10% of students report anxiety as an impeding factor to their academic performance, is what I'm most interested in. It's how does anxiety affect the adult's ability to learn? And by that statistic, we can conclude that even students themselves can recognize that the feelings of worry that they experience actually do have an effect on their ability to learn. So, what's going on when we experience anxiety? Well, in our body, there's a series of symptoms, and we talked a little bit about them earlier. Things like rapid heart rate and breathing, pale or flushed skin, or tense muscles, as you can see in the infographic. That infographic I got from Northwestern Medicine, and they published a larger infographic about anxiety. And in another article from the Harvard Health Publishing, I read about the autonomic nervous system. So When we're experiencing anxiety, our autonomic nervous system takes over, and it's a system in your body that you don't consciously control. But it regulates things like your heart rate, breathing, urination, and even sexual function. It's also the system that reacts when you're under a physical threat. The autonomic nervous system produces a flight or fight response, which is designed to help you defend yourself or run away when you're in danger. So we'll hear that phrase flight or fight a few more times from a few different authors. And the idea that it's the autonomic nervous system is designed to help you defend yourself or run away from danger, in a modern context, it helps us make decisions to mitigate those threats. Going back to the bear metaphor, when we're confronted with that bear and we're experiencing fear, we're going to have an autonomic reaction. We're going to decide to run, or we're going to stand our ground and fight. When we're having anxiety and thinking about that bear, that may be enough to start to trigger this autonomic nervous system and start to feel these physical symptoms. Unfortunately, the physical symptoms of anxiety can cause anxiety themselves, and we'll go on to talk about what we call the anxiety cycle. For some people, when they have a perceived threat that causes anxiety, it starts this cycle where anxiety itself is going to produce physical symptoms, and the physical symptoms end up producing more anxiety, and it is a self-fulfilling thing. It's almost like a snake eating its own tail. Anxiety and stress themselves produce physical symptoms, and on top of that, your reaction to these symptoms can make them worse. The more you focus on them, the more alarmed you become, and the more intense your symptoms become, and it can get out of control. And you might get to a point where just the perception of these symptoms leads you to a point where you're only able to sit and worry. So again, that's moving from the realm of anxiety into disorder. But anxiety tends to work like this in this cyclical manner, and we'll talk about it again when we talk about anxiety in the brain. So these are some more infographics from Northwestern Medicine, and I found them really useful, and also they seem to be on the same page as I am as far as bears. So we've got another image of a bear here. So the part of your brain that deals with anxiety, or that takes over when we're experiencing anxiety, is what's called the limbic system. And the limbic system is comprised of the hippocampus, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the thalamus. And it's responsible for emotional regulation. Scientists have found that those who have anxiety disorders have more activity in their limbic system. And within the limbic system, we have neurotransmitters, which are responsible for communicating to various parts of the brain. We have serotonin, which regulates mood, sleep, and appetite. Norepinephrine, which is linked to alertness and attention. And GABA, or gamma aminobutyric acid, which slows down signals, and it is responsible for inhibitory function, inhibiting our actions. So this idea that we have a built-in flight or flight response in our brain and in our body is echoed by Taylor and Marino, the authors of our course textbook. When they describe the anxious brain, they describe it as anticipating threats and avoiding them, being defensive, and seeking certainty, and finally, always ready to fight or to flee. So that certainty seeking, that fear of the unknown, that can be one of the things that is triggering in an anxiety situation, and it leads to our limbic system and our autonomic nervous system taking over. It's kind of a default. So what we're looking at now is an infographic of a model for studying stress and anxiety, which was created by a researcher named Endler for an article he wrote called Stress, Anxiety, and Coping, the Multidimensional Interaction Model for Canadian Psychology. So that is what we're looking at. We're looking at the multidimensional interaction model of stress, anxiety, and coping. And what it does is it proposes that there's linear and cyclical relationships between state and trait anxiety and personal and environmental factors. It's a very complex diagram. It looks quite simple, but when you start following the arrows around, you can start running around in a circle, which is what it can feel like when you're suffering from anxiety as well. But it gives us some vocabulary for dealing with anxiety and researching it. So particularly trait anxiety, which is related to social evaluation, physical danger, ambiguous situations, daily routines, and state anxiety, which is cognitive worry and emotional autonomic reactions. And this vocabulary was carried forward by another group of researchers, Visupetra, Mikala, and Visupetra in 2012. They wrote an article about the effects of anxiety on executive functions. So 3 executive functions of our brain are updating, inhibition, and shifting. And those are the 3 things that were focused on by these researchers for the International Journal of Psychology. So let's take a look at what those 3 executive functions do, what they're responsible for in our brains. So updating is the ability to oversee actions and behavior as you carry out a task to ensure that it is being carried out according to the plan. So, some examples, like the picture there, we have a carpenter and she's measured and she's checking for square. So she's making sure things are going well in the process of completing the task. In the classroom, things like organizing your work as you solve a math problem and paying attention to make sure you write down the correct number that you retrieve from your calculator are examples of updating. Also, things like paying attention while you're writing notes and scanning actively for mistakes as you do it. Those are classroom examples of updating. So we can see how this would be related closely to education in the sense of task completion and self-directed learning. The next executive function would be inhibition. Inhibition or inhibitory control involves being able to control one's attention, behavior, thoughts, and or emotions to override a strong internal predisposition or external lure and instead do what's more appropriate or needed. Simply put, it's the ability to stay on task and ignore distractions, ignoring irrelevant external stimulus. And the result in the findings of one researcher, Adele Diamond, who's actually a researcher for Children's Hospital here in British Columbia, found that it's involved in creating a reason-based response instead of an impulsive or automatic response. And diminished inhibition is one of the main problems with people who suffer from ADHD. And it can manifest itself in poor control in motor behavior, or what we commonly call hyperactivity. Not being able to sit still, fidgeting. It can manifest itself at an attentional level in terms of distractibility and difficulty paying attention, or at a behavioral level, impulse control. Things like getting mad and yelling out the window at a bad driver, or slamming on your horn in traffic even though nobody's done anything wrong. So we can see also how this could have an effect on the ability to learn. Shifting is the third executive function that they studied, and that's the brain's ability, to switch between behavior and tasks. And also it has to do with the ability to process new information. So someone who has good mental shifting can quickly adapt to new situations and is good at transitioning from one activity to another. They have a good ability to absorb new information, and they're comfortable letting go of old ways of thinking about things. So they're comfortable with new pathways to knowledge, which is very important for learning. So, having studied all of this, Visupetra, Miklia, and Visupetra conclude that updating performance, actually, there's a slight advantage in those who have evaluation anxiety. If you have test anxiety, your updating is actually stronger. It leads to sort of hypervigilance around studying and double checking your test answers. But anxiety has a very negative effect, according to their findings, on the efficiency of inhibition and shifting. Those are negatively affected by both state and trait anxiety. So there's a little bit of a takeaway there that anxiety is useful. It does actually help us in many ways to prepare. But in other ways, it can have a negative effect, primarily on inhibition and shifting. And Visupetra, Miklia, and Visupetra also concluded in their paper that their findings supported the assumptions of another group of researchers, Direkshan, Isanik, and their colleagues, who are the authors of what's called attentional control theory. And the two main assumptions of attentional control theory are, as they appear on the screen. Anxiety impairs the function of goal-oriented directional system, and anxiety increases the influence of stimulus-driven attentional systems, that is, negative attentional control. But they go on to say anxiety may not impair performance effectiveness when it leads to the use of compensatory strategies, such as enhanced effort and increased use of resources. So that gives us a little bit of hope when they say with enhanced effort and increased use of resources, you can mitigate the effects of anxiety on your learning. But it requires more effort. So what are some of the things that trigger anxiety in adult learners? Well, there's internal and external stressors. For many students, going to school can cause high levels of stress and anxiety, largely due to a new situation and competition between other students and themselves, pressure to succeed, external stressors like family demands or work, and internal stressors like the pressure to succeed. Another thing I found is that previous experiences in education. If a student's had a negative experience in education previously, it'll be difficult for them to overcome that. So the effects of anxiety are long-lasting, according to a researcher named Bigdelli, who published a paper called The Anxiety Construct in Adult Learners. And what she found is that we remember our bad or good feelings about a particular situation even years later. We experience our emotions such as happiness, sadness, hatred, and anxiety all through our body, and we remember our emotional experiences, and our minds trigger the same feelings in similar situations. And then we have Malcolm Knowles, the father of andragogy, very prolific writer on adult education, and he talks about the subconscious feelings of resentment and resistance that adults feel when they're imposed upon. And he also talks about the need to know the reason for learning something. So we can interpret that as a form of anxiety, not understanding, not knowing, or a fear of what we don't know. Additionally, if we look at Maslow's hierarchy, which we're looking at an infographic of right now, we have a conceptualization of the needs or goals that motivate human behavior. And if we look at the bottom two tiers, we have safety and physiological needs. This mirrors the idea of self-preservation presented by Taylor and Marino in describing the anxious and curious brain. And essentially, unless we can satisfy those needs, we won't develop needs for things like self-actualization and improvement that comes along with learning. So, according to the National Institute of Health's National Library of Medicine, evidence strongly suggests that stress has a key influence on the process of learning. First of all, stress affects memory recall, and it's well known to most students that the stress undergone when facing an evaluation can make it difficult to recall information. Nevertheless, this impact of stress on the process of encoding into memory is controversial. Some authors defend that stress and anxiety impair memory functions, while others show that stress enhances memory coding. And we saw that earlier with Visupetra and their colleagues. But some writers are a little more direct and harsh about it. Gower, who has written extensively about the effect of anxiety, found that anxiety results in the list we see on the screen: deficient inductive reasoning, slowed decision latencies, and all the way down to the bottom where we have very harsh things like miss or non-achievement, incapability, and malperformance. So it doesn't get much more of a barrier than incapability or malperformance. So that's quite a harsh effect. So what can we do about it? Well, we can offer strategies. We can point our students in the direction of resources, processing resources. My institution offers free counseling and educational intervention from professional counselors. But what can we do as instructors? Well, we have to acknowledge that we have a role, and that starts with acknowledgement. Another thing Big Deli talks about is anxiety is a part of our humanity, and to acknowledge its importance is crucially important in different contexts, especially teaching and learning ones. And additionally, I would say being transparent, sharing the curriculum, letting people know what's expected of them, as suggested by Stephen Brookfield, as well as displaying empathy, being more like the teacher on the top picture as opposed to the bottom. And that brings me to the end. So do we have any questions?
Well, first of all, Adrian, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really